Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. The bombardment of Homs in Syria continues despite international condemnation. And as evidence of deepening tension throughout the country, government elite forces have stormed part of the capital, Damascus. Well, joining us now to discuss the situation in Syria is Dr. Marwa Daoudi, an internationally acclaimed expert on the Middle East. You're a lecturer at St Anthony's College at the University of Oxford in Great Britain and currently a visiting scholar at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs in the United States. Dr. Daoudi, the situation in Syria seems to get worse and worse. The international community seems almost powerless. What, in your view, should it be doing now?
The situation, as you're saying, is extremely worrisome. We're heading towards a full-fledged militarized conflict. And I'd just like to specify that so far, the movement, the Syrian revolution, had been mainly and largely peaceful. And since a few weeks and I would say about a month, we've started seeing more a drift towards armed resistance and clashes. And Homs today, Hama, several cities in Syria have been very brutally besieged by the regime forces. And as we speak, people keep on dying in horrible circumstances. Now, there's been condemnation by the international community, which is something which is useful. There needs to be pressure put on the regime to halt the violence and for the killings to stop in Homs, Hama, the tanks to be withdrawn.
OK, you say there needs to be international pressure, but what sort of international pressure, in your view, would be effective in these circumstances?
I personally rule out any idea of foreign military intervention. I think this is not something which is wanted by the Syrian population, and we have a very bad record in the region of foreign military intervention. Just recalling Iraq, the Iraq war in 2003 has in fact ignited a civil war which the Iraqi people are paying, in fact, the price for until today. The situation in Libya also is not promising. We have rebel groups still fighting each other, chaos starting in the country. So the military option, in my view, is not a viable option and is strongly rejected, I would say, by the majority of the Syrians, even though you have calls for international protection by the people who are besieged. This international protection could take the form, in my view, of human rights fact-finding missions. There should be NGOs such as the Red Crescent, the Red Cross as well, perhaps the Human Rights Council fact-finding mission being sent on the ground to prevent the violence from taking place. And it's worth noting also that a lot of the besieged in Homs said that the brutal attack by the regime forces started in Homs after the departure of the Arab League monitors. So instead of halting the mission should be resent with more observers and more, I would say, well-trained observers, because so far, reading the report of the Arab League, they were very ill-prepared. They were not prepared to confront such a brutal situation. That could be an option. The peacekeeping option is not viable, and it was doomed to fail.
Sorry if I could just interrupt you for sorry to interrupt you for 1 second. You say that
yes,
the peacekeeping option is still a valid one, and yet even when the Arab peacekeepers were there, although the situation certainly appeared to slow down a little bit, the armed operation of the military against the resistance in Syria did continue.
Well, I didn't say the peacekeeping mission was a valid option. I think it was not valid in the sense that you need the consent of the country to have it. So what you need to have is now people who are sent as observers to be able to protect the civilians there, to have them also have access to water, to heat, and to prevent the snipers from shooting at them randomly, from having house-to-house arrest. That could be an option. And also increasing the sanctions against, I would say, the regime officials, not the population, which is already incurring a lot of hardship because of international sanctions, but sanctions against the regime officials to in fact, limit the margins of maneuver internationally and provide international condemnation. All of these options could be also a way of pressuring the regime to stop, in fact, its actions. And I would say also the condemnations, even if symbolic, they do have an impact internally and also regionally for the regime.
Well, judging by what you're saying, you appear to believe that the Syrian regime is open to persuasion. Do you think that's really the case?
I wouldn't say persuasion. I would say their margins, their alternatives are becoming less and less viable. We know about the support by the Russians and the Chinese at the UN Security Council. However, Russia is being encouraged now to shift its position. And if the situation evolves towards like full-fledged, armed conflict, civil war in Syria, which is worrying a lot of the Syrians, and the worry now also is the fact that you hear about armed groups coming from Iraq, perhaps Al-Qaeda also having a role in all this. This is jeopardizing the revolution. This is taking away what was a very legitimate and powerful movement within Syria and making out of it some sort of platform for regional rivalries. This should not be the case. The regional factors have exacerbated the situation, and in that case, we should get away, I would say, from the armed conflict. And that was the dilemma internally in Syria. A lot of the people within the local coordination committees were very reluctant to resorting to arms. Unfortunately, a lot of them had to defend themselves, and that's why they resorted to the arms. But some of them discuss now the possibility of keeping it as a peaceful resistance, which is much more threatening to the regime than having armed resistance, because that feeds in their official discourse about having a foreign conspiracy, having terrorist groups, having armed rebels now within the country. And this is also opening the way for a very dangerous path for Syria's security and stability.
But if the West and the Arab League were to take your advice and were to pursue a purely peaceful path, wouldn't that lead the way open to organizations like Al-Qaeda and others in Iraq to take control, if you like, of the Syrian opposition, or at least to manipulate the Syrian opposition?
Well, my worry is if the Arab League takes a very active role in arming groups within Syria, that opens also the road for the regime to be even more armed by the Russians, to have Al-Qaeda get infiltrated through the borders, and we're entering into a chaotic scenario for the country. Syria has lived a situation of very, lasting stability and security, and the revolution so far had maintained its peaceful nature, and that's what made, in fact, the regime very worried, because they were killing civilians who were in majority unarmed. Now they have a reason to say in front of the large parts of the population who are still on the sidelines thinking, is that a foreign conspiracy? Is that something which is, fomented by external forces, to sit on the sidelines and to perhaps side with the regime, saying, well, in fact, we have armed groups, there's insecurity in the country, and we don't want to have civil war such as in Iraq. So in that sense, I would say the militarization of the revolt is very worrisome, and the Arab League or the Gulf states playing a role by sending weapons, and then perhaps having Turkey, and having on the other side Russia and perhaps Iran sending also weapons, opens the way for, I would say, a very protracted civil war within the country. And that would be very difficult to get over it. And in that case, it might strengthen the regime and make it last much longer, in my view.
Okay, you mentioned there Turkey, and there's been some suggestion of the idea of a buffer zone and the creation of a humanitarian corridor in which Turkey would play some sort of role, not necessarily a military one. But what would you say to that idea?
I think there should not be a humanitarian corridor in the sense that it would need to be enforced militarily. What does it mean to have a humanitarian corridor? It means that there would be Turkish troops on the ground, or perhaps NATO, or perhaps whatever for foreign troops. I think there should be safe havens, clearly, within Turkey, within Lebanon, within the bordering countries, within Iraq as well, for the civilians to be able to flee to and be protected in Turkish territory, in Iraq and in Lebanon. And we know also that some of the regime troops have been able to cross the border to Lebanon and pursue, in fact, the refugees who had been there to protect themselves, to flee the repression. So in that case, safe havens, humanitarian corridors, this is another form, I would say, disguised form of somehow military intervention.
What is the danger, in your view, of this conflict in Syria spreading and becoming a regional sectarian conflict?
Well, it's very unfortunate, because the revolution so far had really kept to its non-sectarian nature. It wasn't about Sunnis against Alawites or against Shias or against whatever other segments. It was really about Syrians, and a large part of the Syrian population who was, in fact, rising against its regime, whatever the religion they belonged to. You have Christians in the revolution. You have Alawites as well, and it's very important to mention that. Some of them have published several bulletins Syrians in the Arab media saying that they were standing with the revolution. Now with the scenarios that we hear about Al-Qaeda perhaps sending or being behind the explosions in Aleppo and Damascus, making it sound like a fight of the Sunnis against the Alawites, or having Iraqi Sunni fighters coming to Syria, and suddenly this is turning into something which was not, in fact, initially the nature of the revolution. And that is why, in my view, the militarization would lead to further sectarian strife, whereas in fact the majority of the revolutionaries within Syria, the young and older generations, have insisted and have been extremely lucid in stating their Syrian identity, saying they are united, they are not Alawites fighting or Sunnis fighting against Christians or Alawites or whatever. They were fighting as Syrians claiming their rights vis-à-vis a regime which has shown a lot of brutality, which has been very brutal in repressing, in fact, the majority of the peaceful movements. So in that case, the sectarian nature is something which has come up in the recent weeks, and I would say it's very worrisome in terms of the future of the country, because Syria has managed so far to keep a very strong cohesion amongst its different communities. And the regime has also portrayed itself as protecting these minorities, which is not true. This has been a long tradition in Syria, and if the minorities believe that after the Assad regime there would be chaos, they would not side with the revolution, and they need to be soothed and also comforted that this is not a Sunni-led or a Muslim Brotherhood-led revolution.
Okay, Marwa Daoudi, thanks very much for being with us. That's all we have time for today, but do stay with us here on France 24 for more news.